Hello and welcome to week 9 of Communication Conflict Resolution. I'm your instructor, Michael Betker. And this week we're moving on to module number 5, where we talk about emotions. Now, if you remember, last week we spent a short week on this deconstructing conflicts. This week we're going to take a look at ourselves a little bit more. We're going to take a look in the mirror and we're going to find out some of the things that make us tick when it comes to our emotions. Of course, that's me there. My cell phone number, 262-490-7493. My email is the best way to reach me if you have any questions. And of course, always have an open invitation for you guys to come visit me face-to-face during my office hours or by appointment. So, pretty simple week this week. We've got, obviously, if you're watching this video, you know that you're off to a good start. I do want you to read the article, Taking the Stress Out of Stressful Conversations, because that's really the focus for this week. The only deliverable this week is a reading quiz, which is number 8, worth 25 points. So that's a pretty light week this week, I would think. Now, along the way here, you want to, at your leisure, I would take a stab at reading Anatomy of an Emotional Hijacking, which is going to be week 11. All right, so let's talk about this article. So, taking the stress out of stressful conversations. Now, we've had these, we've all had them before, and some of us navigate them better than others. But I like this article, how it starts off. It talks about how we live by talking. So the things we say and do on a daily basis, whether it's just general chatter or maybe a tattle or a gossip or a jest, either way, we are eventually embroiled within what I would call stressful conversations. Now, this is most common in the workplace because, as we know, we spend a lot of our time, at least 8 hours a day during the week, if not more, in the workplace. So the article kind of tackles that piece because it is oftentimes those situations in workplace that you see some of these stressful conversations. We in the workplace have challenges to obviously address situations. We've talked about crucial conversations in the past. Whatever the context, stressful conversations differ from other conversations because the emotional loads are really heavy in many cases, right? For example, let's say you've got to give some tough information to a subordinate. Or you've got, conversely, an equal member, equal in terms of power, who is maybe attacking you openly. And obviously, those are two examples, and we'll talk about those in this article here, but two examples of many where, there's stress involved. So what do you do? And this article kind of helps us prepare for those types of things. So we'll talk about that today. Obviously, the stressful conversations can create embarrassment, confusion, anxiety, certainly. In some cases, anger or fear, even in some cases. If not in us, then of course in the counterparts in the interaction. So, as we know, stressful conversations happen, and what happens a lot of times is we do the natural thing, which is to avoid the conversation altogether. Which in some cases maybe not a bad thing, but in a lot of cases, if you let it fester over a period of time, it doesn't go away; it gets worse. So. Now, I would say this, the article talks about this as well, but being able to pick and choose your battles is important. So there's something to that. So it's not maybe you hiding from the conversation. Maybe it's just saying, all right, it's not really the long-range view of the conflict in question or the conversation in question will not benefit me. So it really depends. It's a judgment call. But obviously, if you're letting fear rule your decision-making there, that's not the best way to go forward. Like I said, sometimes avoidance can cost you dearly by making it worse. While there's no cookie-cutter approach to handling stressful conversations, this article, I think, gives us some tools to safely navigate stressful conversations. Communication stress at work. So this article's cool, and it takes you through 3, I would say, most common examples you might encounter. And I've had examples of each of these in my own career, which I'll try to pepper through here. But work is really where you see a lot of this stuff. Why? Because you're oftentimes asked to do a lot in team groups. And invariably, you got personalities and emotions that are kind of embroiled within that, which cause strife and potential for conflict. It's like a breeding ground for conflict. So this article kind of tackles that. How they tackle it, they give us 3 examples. So let's take a look at each of these. The first one is titled, I Have Bad News for You. So it shows both David and Jeremy. Now, David is the managing person here for Jeremy. Jeremy is a hotshot younger person who knows a lot, apparently, or thinks he does. And he's in an environment, and that's one of the things here, the culture, is largely not confrontational. So Jeremy seems to be, cut from a different bolt of cloth almost from his personality standpoint, in that he's somewhat more assertive / aggressive with his teammates. The article talks about how he uses kind of strong humor and other tactics, which has invariably alienated himself from the team. Now, whether or not Jeremy notices that or knows that is up for debate, but ultimately the boss knows, David knows, so he's got a situation on his hands here, right? And again, I mentioned the organizational culture is not confrontational. So what does David do? By the way, too, one of the problems is Jeremy was given a review that wasn't accurate. In other words, because of Jeremy's strong-minded character, a previous manager had not given him the honest truth about his performance. So Jeremy's kind of going off in a direction thinking he's all that in a bag of chips, and the reality is David's got more sobering information for him. So this, either way, is a conversation that David has to have with Jeremy about, kind of bringing him down to earth a bit and helping him reset. So difficult challenge for both parties. Obviously, David is somewhat reticent to levy that information. And I would say this case here, getting off to the right start is critical for success. Well, unfortunately, didn't happen. So what happened was David kind of caught Jeremy flat-footed, and just pretty much laid it out there for Jeremy. Jeremy the whole time making an icy stare down at his shoes or at the floor, while David levied his almost indictment of Jeremy. And what happened there was 2 days later, so the bad thing is Jeremy decided to leave the company and find greener pastures, taking with him a lot of cultural and organizational wisdom. So it's a loss for both parties, essentially. Now, that could have been handled differently, and I've seen this happen a lot in my own career, where you get a bad interaction that leads to discord and then ultimately departure. So we'll talk more about this one when we get up to the point where we want to say, all right, how do we fix this problem? So, but I have bad news for you. So delivering bad news, it's a very dicey situation in a lot of cases, and personalities and emotions can really kind of color that. All right, the second one the article talks about is titled "What's Going On Here?" and it features a person by the name of Elizabeth and a person by the name of Raphael. So they're team leaders on a major project which has not gone well. And so they're sitting there together as two managers, equal managers, trying to sort through, after the bomb drop, basically on a bad project, and how are they going to kind of fix the problem. So they're up there whiteboarding the situation, and Elizabeth is taking the lead at the whiteboard, according to the article. And then at one point she asks of Raphael, "Is that it then?" Which touches off a powder keg. And by the way, the article talks about this is a common thing where you've got suddenly out of the blue, sunny day, and suddenly a storm cloud appears and starts raining on your parade. And that's what happens here the minute Elizabeth says, "Is that it then?" What happens is Raphael responds very poorly to that, making hyperleaps in judgment, stating that Elizabeth was trying to kind of lord over him or direct his activities when they're both equal. So Elizabeth handled this kind of almost in a flummoxed way. She wasn't expecting Raphael's response at all. And so what she did was naturally to acquiesce to Raphael in the short term to placate the situation for him. But what it ultimately did was kick the can down the road, and it did not help the situation at all. So, there was not equal status or even, equal footing in that situation. So what happened ultimately is Elizabeth chafed and continued to chafe against Raphael, and then ultimately left the project, which obviously is not good for anybody on that team, particularly if she's good at what she does and they're still facing problems. So I guess remember the conversation we've had about the invisible iceberg. You got the tip of the iceberg poking above the waters, and you've got all these other things going on underneath. That's really what's happening here, in my opinion, and that's what the article talks a bit about. There's these invisible parties creating a lot of static. So we don't know Raphael's story necessarily, right? Which could be driving a lot of this stuff here. So that's really what's going on here. These things that Raphael may have issues for that Elizabeth doesn't know about. So she gets caught flat-footed and essentially leaves. Food for thought here. What causes Elizabeth, as we remember from how women generally handle this kind of conflict or static, is she's automatically wanting to assume fault somehow for Raphael's behavior, like she had done something wrong, and even tried to correct that, but to no avail. So that's part of the problem, I think, is that women generally like to, their default in a lot of cases is to take blame for something like this. What is causing Rafael to think that Elizabeth is taking over? Well, we know, obviously, if you think about the issues iceberg, it could be a number of things. A lot of variables at play here. So like I said, there's no cookie-cutter approach, but there's things you can do, and we'll talk about the solutions here for what Elizabeth could have done differently to keep things on track with Rafael. This third one here, you are attacking me. I have had personal experience with all these, but most recently in the last 5 years, I had a colleague who would play the Karen role. Let's call her Melissa because that's her name. Anyway, so this could be Mike and Melissa or Nick and Karen, but I was playing the Nick role in this case here, and I actually remember having this kind of conversation. But essentially what it is a person who is very aggressive and uses what are called thwarting tactics. Open aggressive tactics like accusation, distortion, and digression to hold sway over another. So it's a strong arm technique that I was surprised to see. I didn't think it really happened a lot, but I was actually my Karen or Melissa really demonstrated this stuff in an open field. So really surprising to me, and it caught me flat-footed, and I had to regroup. So ultimately what happened here was these guys couldn't work together, primarily because Karen used these tactics and Nick was kind of unsure how to handle it. His deferral from any attempt there felt empty and didn't work, basically. So what happened was they lost the account, and over time they were both equally passed over promotion because they were not able to work together. So I think the fact, too, that Nick had to go and seek out help from his manager was a problem, right? So wherever possible, here's the thing, just word to the wise, too, and I don't know if this is in the article or not, but try to handle your affairs on your own without getting your boss involved. If you have to do that, that's pretty much a lost argument already. So, all right. So obviously we know that can happen, thwarting tactics. And like I said, in my case, my thwarter, Melissa, pretty much did everything she could. Just to give you a little background on that, she came in as an equal manager to me, but right away had aspirations to go above me, and so saw me more as an obstacle to her growth in her career. And she came from a military background. I'm not saying that's the only reason why she did some of the things she did, but she had a very top-down philosophy and used pretty much every dirty trick in the book to try to get ahead. So didn't work out well for her in the end, and obviously I survived that, but it wasn't pleasant at all. So how did I handle that? I actually did some things that the book talks about. So preparing for stressful conversations. So once I met Melissa, I took her to lunch, and I realized afterward, like shortly after lunch, that I read her body language, and I just sensed right away that this was not going to be a pleasant relationship. So, and then of course my thinking was validated by some of the stuff she did that first week even. There's no honeymoon period for her at all. And so I went home and I was like, man, and my wife and I thankfully talked, and she was able to help me, talk me off the ledge, first of all, but secondarily, what we did was we practiced. So, she played the role of Melissa, my wife, which, she's nothing like Melissa, but nonetheless played the hard-nosed role and allowed me to kind of go through some scenarios with her. So that's the first thing you can do. You can really prepare for stressful conversations. So in the case of David, Elizabeth, and Nick, things may have gone better had they done this, right? If they are more aware of what the book or the article talks about as their vulnerabilities. And for me, I'm just not used to people strong-arming me or doing that kind of stuff in work. Now, the company I work for had kind of fostered that environment. So, I knew I was kind of in that situation. So Melissa was able to thrive in that situation, as were, some of these stories here we've read in the article. So things could have gone better. So the first thing I would say is you look in the mirror and take an honest assessment of your abilities to handle these types of situations, right? So how do you handle stress? Do you go silent or do you become violent? Either way, it's good to know your danger zones. For example, using the case of Melissa, her danger zone was that she tended to react emotionally and lash out. Mine was more or less just like to feel incredulous that somebody would even do that. So Nick and Karen both attempted in their own situations to be rational, but were unsuccessful ultimately because things did not go as they had planned. So rationality is not always the best answer. In the case of David and Jeremy, David could have broken the meeting up into two separate occasions. versus catching, Jeremy off guard and causing that sort of one-sided conversation, which led to a bad result. So David's distaste for conflict was a factor in the situation for sure, and he just had a ripping the Band-Aid off approach, which didn't work. So he could have basically said, all right, let's have a first meeting here. I'm going to talk about kind of some things that have been going on. We got to talk about this through, and I want to give you a chance to prepare for the meeting. The second meeting, then, Jeremy could come back and have his arguments, and then you can use things like active listening, other things to kind of get through the issues, versus just that one and done, rip the Band-Aid off kind of approach, which left Jeremy without any recourse. Like I said, rehearse with a neutral friend like your loved ones or somebody like a roommate or somebody else, but run the gambit of things and fine-tune your approach. The other thing I want to mention to you guys you can do, which can help a lot in many cases, is have a few hip pocket phrases, which my wife and I think we actually plan for a couple of these things. So if X or Y is said, you can have a phrase that kind of shuts that phrase down, that comment or that approach down. So more on that in a minute, but you can have those in your hip pocket and ready to pull out at a moment's notice. We always had those moments where, gosh, I wish I would have said this, or I wish I would have said that, right? So having these hip pocket phrases. Here's my favorite one. I had heard somebody use this once in a meeting. They said, somebody said something to disrupt a meeting that this person was having, and the guy who running the meeting said, "Hey, so and so, thanks, but I'm not looking for your comment right now." And that pretty much just shut the room up and shut him up. And it wasn't anything like he said, "You're a jerk, you're a jerk." He just said, "Hey, I'm not looking for your comment at the moment," which was a simple thing. So I've used that since, and my family now has taken it upon themselves to use that phrase. I'm not looking for your comment right now. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it is a showstopper for sure. All right, so the article then talks about how do you manage the conversation. So practice is good, but it's not enough. So this article talks about 3 important techniques that you can employ to really prepare and be better prepared to handle difficult conversations. The first one here is honor thy partner. So really what you can do here, in the case of the first one, David and Jeremy, David could have taken some ownership over Jeremy's current situation, right? And taken some of the sting out of that conversation. So acknowledging some fault, even if you don't have much fault, acknowledging some helps to level the playing field. So that's an important piece, right? Of this first one here. Honor thy partner and acknowledge, hey, we all have crosses to bear. We all have things that we're going through. So try to find some common ground through taking some of the blame or some of the fault. It also helps to mitigate future problems. So, for example, Jeremy bad-mouthing the company when he leaves, which is probably what he'll be doing. If you handle this a little bit more holistically, in other words, taking some of the blame, you'll help mitigate that as well. So that's honor thy partner. The second one the article talks about is called disarming by restating your intentions. So using a couple examples here to show this, in the argument between Elizabeth and Raphael, Elizabeth needs a technique that doesn't require her to understand the underlying reasons for Raphael's strong reaction, but still helps her handle the situation effectively. So you're not asked to be a desk side psychologist in this case here, right? But you can use things like what's called a clarification technique. She could have said, quote, "I can see how you took what I said the way you did, Raphael. That wasn't what I meant. Let's go over this list again." So it's almost like hitting a reset button by saying that, right? So it's called a clarification technique. I can see how you might have taken that wrong, Raphael. And maybe you don't see that, but if you say that, then at least Raphael knows you have acknowledgement of his issues. Now, that may not make it go away entirely, but what that does is it allows the conversation to continue without any conflict. So that's disarming by restating your intentions. I'm throwing this to fight tactics, not people. This is a big one. And obviously, we want to personalize things. Emotions, we talked about, when somebody cuts you off when they're driving, you immediately think that person's a jerk, right? Well, maybe they're sick, or maybe something else is going on. So we want to focus on the things that the people are doing, not the people themselves. And that's the most important thing, I think, of this. In the case of Nick and Karen, Nick can't simply disarm Karen as she is using openly aggressive thwarting tactics like my friend Melissa. But he can separate her tactics from her character. And this is what I started doing with Melissa as well. I named the things she was doing. She was never passive-aggressive, so I actually called out bold-faced lies or other tactics that she would use. I'd state them out in the open. in a matter-of-fact, non-emotional way. And I made sure that others knew it as well, and others did know that she was doing that, and ultimately that did not end up well for her. But the point is, when you name it, it makes it much harder for them to use it. They think they're being kind of secretive about it, but if you call it out what it is, if you're being passive aggressive or anything like that, that automatically takes away some of the power. So here's an example what Nick could have said. Karen, we've worked together pretty well for a long time. I don't know how to talk about what went wrong in the meeting when your take on what happened and what's going on now is so different from mine. So it's a really clear way of restating it, right? So saying here's what's going on here, and laying it out there for her, right? So he didn't attack Karen, or he wasn't also her pawn either, and that's really what Karen wanted. Karen wanted to make him her pawn, and control the conversation through these strong arm tactics. Nick could have changed the game by simply identifying the tactic for what it was, and then, of course, by extension, then disarming it. So that's the third piece there. All right, last thing I want to share is this, not in the article here, but just some other tips and tricks for you guys to think about as you wend your way through life. First thing I would say is, get curious, ask questions about the real motives and needs and concerns behind the other person's actions. Again, that issues iceberg we've talked about before. Just try to find out more, learn more before you start weighing in and having your own opinion that might lead to conflict. By extension from that, be curious, ask questions, always be neutral as much as you can, and be patient. Take the time to really understand the other person's perspective before you kind of start weighing in. The third is make the conflict safe for the other person. Be ready to listen until they feel you understand their viewpoint. So again, that's kind of leads off of the first and second. And the fourth is hold the other person's viewpoint as equally valid and just as important as yours. I know that may be difficult, and of course, I usually think I'm right in most of my arguments, but I try my best to kind of weigh in, or at least acknowledge the other person's point of view. And last point here on this graphic, don't have the difficult conversation until you have an open mind and can stay calm. So I say this a lot to my kids and anybody else. Take a beat, take 2 beats, take 3 beats, take 10 seconds. You've heard that. Hold your breath and count to 10, or take 10 breaths, take 15 breaths, take a day even if you have to. But wait until you are ready and have an open mind and really can have a strategy, almost have a strategy for navigating through the conflict. We've talked about this already, but here's another bonus tip from this. It's really helpful to role play a difficult conversation, and that helped me tremendously with my difficult person. All right, so that's a short sort of lecture here on week 9, and obviously we're talking about stressful conversations. So how do you navigate those? The quiz here is open book. It's 45 minutes and 25 questions.